Thanks for coming out today. This is a great turnout. I understand that turnout is often depressed by sad weather. So I'm glad to see everybody out today. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to Cal's for having me. Can you hear me okay? I haven't spoken into a microphone for a while. I might pull that up a little bit. I have lived in downtown Little Rock, close by, for the last 6 years, but I've spent more time driving back and forth between Conway than being involved in programs like this one, so I'm especially excited to join you. And for my talk, I want to talk about 3 topics today. First, I want to give you an overview of the new Madrid earthquakes, just a quick overview, and talk a little bit about the kind of broad basis for my book project, Convulsed States, Earthquakes, Prophecy, and the Making of Nations in Early America. And then I want to talk about the specific parts of the book that address Central Arkansas. First, a Quapaw account of the earthquakes, and then the role of some legislation, the new Madrid Relief Act of 1850, and the way that that, along with land speculation, abetted Quapaw dispossession in the 1820s and 1830s. First, let me start with the earthquakes themselves, and I suspect being in this part of the country, you don't need as much of an introduction as somebody who grew up in North Carolina did, especially if you've heard from Little Rock's own Canevry Bolton Valencius, or have read her book, which I recommend, The Lost History of the New Madrid Earthquakes. But a quick primer on the earthquakes and how I used the earthquakes in the book project. So they began in mid-December 1811, and all told there were 3 major timblers in the winter of 1811 into 1812, plus dozens of aftershocks that lasted into the spring. Estimates of their magnitude vary, right? When you're talking about an earthquake more than 200 years ago and you're putting together eyewitness accounts, it's kind of hard to be precise about their magnitude on the Richter scale. But recently, seismologists have kind of downgraded their impact a little bit. Whereas maybe 10 or 15 years ago, we might have talked about them being like 8 or 9 on the Richter scale, something closer to 7. But that still made them the strongest shaking in the North American interior since at least the 1300s, right? So these were unprecedented earthquakes. But they were not entirely unheard of to native communities, particularly communities that were living in this area. Many of these groups have oral histories in which earthquakes feature prominently. And that's especially the case if we think broadly about native people living within the boundaries of the United States. It's especially the case along the West Coast, but also among groups in the central and eastern parts of the continent. Right, so earthquakes are quite central to oral histories and pictographs, drawings along more seismologically active regions, so in the Pacific Northwest and in California. But I suspect that we have ancient evidence of seismological activity at Petit Jean. This is not a great photo. I took it with my iPhone in a dark space in a cave. Has anybody ever seen the rock drawings at Petit Jean? They're very much worth checking out, and I think they're a great reminder of the ancient human presence here in the region. I'm going to sort of point here, but if you see there are some kind of fuzzy, wavy lines, these are precisely the kind of lines that we see in more seismologically active regions in cave drawings in the Pacific Northwest and in California, right? So I suspect that they represent seismicity here in the middle of the continent. And these particular pictographs at Petit Jean date back about 1,000 years or so to the Woodland or Mississippian periods. And again, I think they represent evidence of this long-held human recognition of seismicity in this region. I also read, I'll add this, last week, that there are some mounds built by native people that are much older than these cave drawings that date back about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in the Missouri boot heel, so at the epicenter of the earthquakes, mounds that were built over cracks in the ground that were created by earthquakes. So this was news to me, but reading an archaeological volume very recently, even more ancient evidence of Native people, grappling with the significance of this, particularly in a kind of sacred way by constructing a mound there much longer ago, even than these cave drawings in Pedigene. So a map like this one betrays a kind of eastward-facing bias, right? And it took moving to Arkansas to really, shake my fist at this map, right? And that really is where historians and scientists have kind of looked east from the epicenters to consider the impact of the earthquakes on nature and on people, east of us. But a map like this one gives a better sense of the continental scope of the earthquake's reach. And this is kind of a rough estimate that I created rather rudimentarily. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these sites of interpretation that I focus on in the book. But this blue circle, I think, gives us a sense of the continental scope, widens our perspective beyond facing east, and shows us that the earthquakes reached people in the Great Lakes, from the Great Lakes south to the Gulf of Mexico, and from the eastern Great Plains to the Atlantic coast. The contemporaneous account, the farthest west I found, is from an Oto Indian town on the Missouri River. There are also accounts from New Orleans and the Great Lakes, as well as along the Atlantic coast, about as far north as Philadelphia. And as I said, this map also depicts some important sites of earthquake interpretation from the book. And as a way of discussing Native American understandings of the earthquakes, I want to head here to Prophetstown, where an intertribal gathering of Native people from across the Ohio Valley and even beyond was established by the Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. You might have heard of both leaders, but I bet you've heard of Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a major figure in this era of the War of 1812 who sought to inspire intertribal resistance against the United States. And he traveled widely across the Mississippi River Valley, seeking allies to join him in militancy to repel the United States. His brother Tenskwatawa, who is known as the kind of spiritual leader of this movement, Tecumseh is thought of as more of the kind of military political leader. Tenskwatawa began that militancy when he attacked William Henry Harrison's encampment in November 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So you probably have heard of Tecumseh, you may have heard of Tenskwatawa, but I bet you haven't heard this, because I think I'm the first person to find it. In 1807, he predicted the earthquakes. He said that in 4 years, nature was basically going to rise up to destroy unbelievers. And I argue that this prediction was central to the reconstitution of his intertribal militancy after this embarrassing loss at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Tenskwatawa could still garner a following because he claimed to control, or at least predict, dangerous natural forces. And the earthquakes were evidence of that power. Right? I tell my students this is like my, is it those Nicolas Cage movies where he sort of divines new things about like lost versions of the Declaration of Independence. It's called like American Treasure or whatever, right? Like this sort of Indiana Jones. This is the one moment in my career where I kind of like sat up and thought, well, like, I don't understand how he foretold this earthquake, but he did. And he wasn't the only figure religious leader across Native and US societies to situate the earthquakes into waves of prophecy and revivalism that were taking place cross-culturally. Right? Across Native American and US settler societies, this was a time when people were really working out the relationship between politics and religion in this era of nation-making. So this is an image of Tenskwatawa that might be familiar. Later in his life, he sat for a painting by George Catlin in 1830. So the book that, the subtitle of which deals with the remaking of nations, takes Tenskwatawa's prophecy seriously, but also thinks about the ways in which the governments of not only intertribal militants in the Ohio Valley, but people in the Cherokee Nation, in the Creek Nation, and in the United States, were all kind of similarly undergoing political consolidations. They were all in the process of making nations in the early 19th century. And they were also interested in projecting sovereignty, right, through diplomatic arrangements and the raising of national militaries. And this would all come to bear on the War of 1812. So for the US, sovereignty was at the heart of the War of 1812. Sovereignty is at the heart of political issues in the US today, right? Americans were enraged that the British were seizing US sailors and impressing them into the British Navy. And they also accused the British of encouraging native attacks on US settlers in the Ohio Valley. But sovereignty was also a central concern of Native Americans in the Ohio Valley and the southern Appalachians. That sovereignty was more about territorial defense than expansion at this time. But we see this kind of common pattern of a desire for political consolidation, for the creation of sovereign nations, not only in the US, but also as a reaction to the expansion of the US among Native people. And as part of that nation-making, questions arose about what should the role of religion, and in particular the role of revivalism, be in these nations. Should political and religious authority be bound together? And a lot of figures, not just Tenskwatawa, but preachers kind of across the United States, use the earthquakes to argue that religious and political authority should be bound together more tightly. And people often emerge from social margins to make those arguments, right? And they really use the earthquakes and the kind of broader geopolitical upheaval of the War of 1812 era to say that. So in the US, you start to see more arguments for a kind of Christian nationalism. You see Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa seeking to bind religious and political authority in the Ohio Valley. And you also have prophets urging territorial and cultural purity among Creeks and Cherokees. And this ultimately erupts into full-scale civil war among the Creeks as part of the Red Stick War, which is kind of a spin-off of the War of 1812. And so there are figures within each of these nations who are pointing to the earthquakes as signs of divine dissatisfaction with the regular orders of politics and culture within their cultures. There are also people pushing back against this across these societies, right? Saying that these people are being kind of opportunistic and need to be kept in line. So that's kind of the frame for the larger book. But I want to focus on the part of the book that deals with where we are today in Central Arkansas. And talk about, first, a Quapaw account of the earthquakes, and then the way in which, over time, some legislation related to land damage facilitated or helped to contribute to Quapaw dispossession. So the Quapaws were, of course, west of the War of 1812's hotspots and didn't have these disputes about domestic political authority and sovereignty, but they were probably familiar with Tecumseh. Tecumseh traveled widely, sent emissaries across the eastern half of the continent so he would not have been unheard of to him. But not everybody turned to Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa to interpret the earthquakes, right? Despite the remarkable nature of Tenskwatawa's prophecy. The Quapaws were also, importantly closer to the earthquake's epicenters than many of the other groups that I discuss in the book. And remarkably, their memories of the shaking resonated into the 20th century. So in the 1960s, right, 150 years after the earthquakes, a Quapaw elder who's pictured here earlier in her life, named Mary Maud Angel, was interviewed about Quapaw customs and history. And her interviews were recorded, and those recordings and transcriptions are linked from the Quapaw's official tribal website today. Mary Maud Angel, who was also known as Grandma Supernaw, was in her late 70s, early 80s during these interviews. And she walked the interviewer through a range of important topics in Quapaw history and culture. The story of the Quapaws first meeting Europeans, Quapaw conflicts with the Osage, Quapaw naming customs. She also talked about Quapaw ritual responses to the earthquakes. If you look on the website, the sort of list of topics goes from Quapaws meet the Europeans to earthquakes, right? It kind of speaks to the significance of this within the community memories of different groups at the time. And the fact that these earthquakes appear in her stories and descriptions of Quapaw culture a century and a half after the shaking, I think speaks to their significance and the depth of cosmological disruption that the earthquakes betoken to people. Mary Maud Angel told of falling trees and collapsing hills as scared older people gathered to pray, sing, talk, and smoke tobacco through the night. In the morning, they put cloth, tobacco, and other important items in a large brass kettle and took the kettle along with a horse down to the riverbank, where they drowned the kettle and the horse in a show of sacrifice. Right? They take important items, valuable, culturally significant items, offer those items up in the river, which might well be the river over there. And after this sacrifice, the earthquake stopped. This type of specific, tribally based ritual response was a common way that Native Americans addressed the shaking. And rather than turning to Tenskwatawa or adopting other outside religious customs, it shows that they had mechanisms in place for trying to rebalance order through established rituals. So there were certainly people who turned to Tenskwatawa during the earthquakes, but the experiences of Quapaws and other Native groups shows that there was a great range of Native ideas and strategies in action, not only for addressing the earthquakes, but for addressing the wider environmental and geopolitical tumult that accompanied the attempt of U.S. expansion during this era of the War of 1812. And one of my book's major points is that everybody in the early 19th century is drawing connections among signs of disorder, right? The environment, broader cosmological issues, political, social issues, right? They're drawing all kinds of connections among those questions. They're not kind of cleaving off environmental issues to a sort of scientific realm, right? Which is quite interesting to me in the sense that we've kind of gone back to the future when we think about human impacts on environmental change today and environmental disasters today, right? I also argue that in any era of North American history, looking at a response like the Quapaws and also entertaining Tenskwatawa's prophecy shows that we would be wise to recognize a strategic and ideological range among Native people, especially in conflicts like the War of 1812, right? Especially in the era of North American history after the founding of the United States, when we often think about all Native groups being existing in opposition to the United States. Simply not the case in most any military conflict. right? It's important to recognize that strategic and ideological diversity. So the earthquakes reverberated into the 20th century in Quapaw oral history, but they also played a specific material factor in the dispossession and removal of Quapaw people in this place, in central Arkansas. And I found this evidence at the Arkansas State Archives, and it involves connecting a number of dots related to law, land speculation, and the establishment of Little Rock as the territorial capital of Arkansas. I also grant that there are people who know more than I'll ever know about territorial Arkansas and early state history. I got a little nervous when I met Judge Arnold. But I think that this is a lesser known but important aspect of the simultaneous founding of Little Rock and the dispossession of the Quapaws. So this story starts in the Missouri Boot Heel, in the epicenter of the earthquakes in southeastern Missouri, as it's called there today, with William Clark of Lewis and Clark expedition fame, who was the governor of Madrid Territory. And William Clark appealed on behalf of the Missouri territorial legislature to the U.S. Congress, wanting to help out those U.S. settlers whose land had basically been ruined by the earthquakes. Right? Farmers find themselves simply unable to farm on territory that's either been flooded or swamped or cracked. Right? A lot of the evidence of the earthquake has actually been covered up over time by industrial agriculture. This is something that Dr. Valencius in The Lost History of the New Madrid Earthquakes details, right? The way in which, large farming equipment basically covers over cracks, literally, the way that those people 4,000 or 5,000 years ago were covering over cracks with mounds. So, in a resolution passed by the Missouri Territorial Assembly, he emphasized the extent of the damage among lands closest to the epicenter. And in this resolution, they said whole districts have been depopulated and many valuable farms utterly destroyed. Residents were wandering without a home to go to or a roof to shelter them from the pitiless storms. The U.S. Congress had recently delivered foreign aid to Venezuelan rebels after an earthquake in March 1812 in Caracas. And Clark said, if the U.S. government is going to support Venezuelans following an earthquake at the same time, they owe it to these settlers in southeast Missouri. Right? He said the U.S. was obligated to provide for its own citizens. And so he proposed granting public land to U.S. landholders who were affected by the earthquakes. Congress obliged the next year, enacting what was called an Act for the Relief of the Inhabitants of the Lake County of New Madrid in the Missouri Territory who suffered by the earthquakes. And in this legislation, those whose lands had been materially injured by the earthquakes were to file claims and then receive certificates that entitled them to up to 160 acres of public land to relocate elsewhere. Right? So you appeal to government authorities, you get a certificate, and then you can plop that certificate down for 160 acres of U.S. land elsewhere. This is one of the first instances that I can find of a kind of social welfare in response to a disaster, right? This is sort of early 19th century FEMA. And U.S. landholders rushed to take advantage of what was well-intentioned legislation, but the decades of speculation, fraud, and legal wrangling that followed showed that this created a kind of bureaucratic mess, which I suppose is also FEMA of the early 19th century. Just months after the law passed, President Madison's secretary reported this. The speculators went instantly to work and procured these poor, ignorant people's claims for a mere song. Sections have been known to be sold for a few yards of calico, and the whole of their claims are now in the hands of speculators. We will now see how the keen speculators fatten upon its most charitable and praiseworthy liberality, he warned. So there were pretty quickly problems in determining who was entitled to new land. An attorney and politician in 1823 wrote that the details of the law seemed to me to be clouded in ambiguities. Federal government agents were surprised at how much land settlers claimed was damaged. And they grew concerned that people with less than 160 acres in New Madrid were boosting their holdings with certificates for 160 acres of public land elsewhere. This is also like the golden age of counterfeiting. If you ever read about, there's a great book about counterfeiting in the 19th century. So certificates were forged or mistakenly assigned to the wrong person. I will venture to say that the New Madrid law, as it is termed, has given rise to more fraud and more downright villainy than any law ever passed by the Congress of the United States. And if the claims are not immediately decided upon, will involve the citizens of Missouri in endless litigation and trouble, in addition to numerous frauds practiced upon the government. This was one U.S. government official writing to another about the headache that the process of filing for claims and then seeking to figure out the legitimacy of those claims had created. He went on to add that in numerous instances, people who had not a shadow of a claim to land surrendered received land certificates, while the real owner continued in quiet possession of his property. And there seemed to be no limits to the number of certificates an individual could compile. So one of the problems here is that people who recognize the kind of value of this would come to actual landholders in New Madrid County. They may come down from St. Louis and trade them something like a couple yards of fabric, calico in one case, for one of these certificates. Not to mention the possibility that certificates could be forged. And I wish I had taken a picture. There are a number of these certificates in the Arkansas State Archives, which kind of foreshadows why this matters for Little Rock. In numerous instances, people who had not a shadow of a claim to the land surrendered received certificates. So federal agents start to seek clarification for the implementation of the law and warning that land certificates could not be traced back to original owners. They started, not only people from the outside came in and bought these certificates up, but then they started trading them, right? There became like a marketplace for these, and they start becoming increasingly valuable. As this government official concern percolates, Missouri politicians defended their constituents' propriety and pleaded with federal officials to honor all certificates. They claimed that the certificates had passed through the hands of many individuals of the most worthy and respectable class of our citizens, with the understanding that they were legitimate. Still into the 1820s, federal officials sought documentation to certify the authenticity of certificates, right? So they wanted something to back up one's claim beside the certificate for 160 acres. By 1826, about half of the 180,000 acres worth of land certificates had actually been exchanged for land patents elsewhere. In Missouri archives, I found an 1828 deposition where the guardian of children allegedly orphaned by the earthquakes appealed for land certificates on their behalf. And there wasn't a resolution to the case accompanying this deposition. When I first read this, I thought, wow, this is so awful, right? Like orphan kids who want land claims. But then I started thinking about the fact that there are just a very few number of casualties reported broadly with the earthquakes, right? And if you think about the combination of the low casualty estimates accompanying the earthquakes, plus the rampant fraud and speculation that accompanied the issuing of these certificates, I'm kind of wondering if adopting earthquake orphans was one strategy for seeking to amass certificates. In the end, the federal government continued to address claims and deal with lawsuits into the 1870s, right? So one of those early government officials who said, we're going to be dealing with this for a long time, was correct. And about 20 of the original landholders in New Madrid County resettled on new tracts of land. As a late 19th century Missouri historian and novelist wrote, settlers in earthquake-damaged land were mostly ignorant backwoodsmen, and shrewd and unscrupulous speculators cheated them out of their claims so that they received no substantial benefit from the law. So what does this have to do with Arkansas? Well, a lot of speculators took their land certificates to central Arkansas. And those certificates changed hands constantly. And as territorial pressure on the Quapaws increased, so too did the value of those certificates, as well as legal controversy about the validity of those certificates. In 1818, the Quapaws ceded 30 million acres south and west of the Arkansas River in exchange for a reservation of 1 million acres and annuities. This map on your right is a map basically showing Osage Territorial cessions in yellow and Quapaw cessions below in red. If you walk a couple blocks down to the Arkansas River, you'll see that original 1818 treaty line basically dividing downtown Little Rock. This is one evidence of the line. You can also see the line marked over at the Art Center, MacArthur Park. Right, so it basically cleaves what becomes Little Rock in half. We are, I'm not sure which side we're on, but we're right near the line right today, right? And after this Quapaw land cession, a consortium of prominent attorneys, politicians, and businessmen in St. Louis that had been accumulating New Madrid land certificates began seeking titles to this ceded land. And in particular, they were interested in the titles to the ceded land right here, right? They wanted to kind of border this new Quapaw reservation, which was a temporary reservation, which is in blue on that map. Certificates that previously sold for $4,000 soon skyrocketed in value, going for as much as $4,000. And not only are certificates being traded, but fractions of certificates are being traded. So in one case, a man paid $1,000 for 1/3 of the land promised in a certificate. So they plop these certificates down here, and then start asking around if this can be the territorial capital, right? Which might raise the value of the land further, but this was risky business. The Quapaw cession had opened up land for speculation and settlement, but there was a buffalo hunter who had established a cabin on this land that was eventually co-owned by a different group of speculators and territorial legislatures who claimed that they should have preemption through what was called the 1814 Preemption Act, that this property belonged to them because they had previously improved this property by establishing the cabin there. So ultimately we have two sets of speculators claiming this territory, and they are lobbying territorial legislatures to not only honor their claims, but also to establish this as the territorial capital. Territorial legislators end up co-owning one group of speculator, the one that were affiliated with the buffalo hunting cabin. They're brought in on the deal, and then this becomes the territorial capital. Courts then ruled that this St. Louis consortium that had brought the New Madrid land certificates could not supersede the preemption claims established by the original hunter and his group, But in 1828, both groups of speculators and legislators settle. And ultimately, the value of this land, coupled with the kind of pressure that the increasing settlement on valuable territorial capital land, leads to a second Quapaw cession. Right? In 1824, the Quapaw Seed, the reservation that was granted to them through the land cession in 1818, and decide to move to northwestern Louisiana. They lived briefly in northwestern Louisiana before returning to pockets of their homelands in the early 1830s, before ultimately relocating to Indian Territory in what is today eastern Oklahoma in 1833. So what does this all mean? Right, to put it more basically, the establishment of Little Rock was a prominent factor in Quapaw territorial dispossession. Without the value of this place rising through its designation as the territorial capital, without the fact that people take these New Madrid Relief Certificates from this consortium in St. Louis and want to plop down here, I don't think you get pressure that leads to the Quapaws ceding territory. So accumulating New Madrid land certificates, applying them to new ceded land, and then lobbying to designate that land as the territorial capital was a factor in abetting Quapaw dispossession from this place. So the loss of life and immediate material damages from these massive earthquakes was reasonably light. Right, there are accounts of handfuls of people drowning or disappearing into cracks during the earthquakes. And these earthquakes certainly remade the landscape near their epicenters, right? They made previously farmable land unfarmable. They also collapsed riverbanks, created swamplands and lakes. But for historians, for me in particular, I think their primary importance lies in their geographical scope, right? And the fact that we can take a common event at a certain, couple times in late 1811 and 1812 and survey nearly half the continent for what people thought this remarkable, unprecedented event meant. And not only that, we can kind of survey across social strata, right? So this isn't like a treaty where we just get sort of the input of elites or people that are responsible for interacting with the United States. So we typically have to deal with Native American history, right? We can kind of dig down and look across social strata for people's responses. And so this large scope allows for a comparative analysis then of the relationship between political and religious authority across these sites of nation-making. It also allows us to examine a range of interpretations and responses from Indian country, right, including that response from the Quapaws in central Arkansas that was told through lines of storytellers among the Quapaws through Mary Maud Angel in the middle of the 20th century. But despite the fact that I told you that I think these earthquakes are as important for their scope as they are for their effect, the indirect role that the New Madrid Relief Act of 1815 played in the simultaneous establishment of Little Rock and the dispossession of Quapaws shows that some of these earthquakes' material impacts were delayed and hidden. But for Quapaw people, these transformations became immediate and they became profound when Little Rock was established. So I want to stop there and leave time for questions. Thanks. Yes?
Here's a question. Where were you sitting and what were you reading when you found the prophet's prediction of 1807?
I was sitting in a storage facility in Salem, Massachusetts, of all places. The Peabody Essex Museum has a collection of manuscripts. It's a great art museum. And it was kind of a game of telephone that missionaries were playing with one another. So New England missionaries had correspondents in Indian country, some of whom were opposed to the prophet. So it was actually a native opponent of the Shawnee prophet named Hendrik Apamet, who was writing to another missionary, whose letter ended up there. And I've tried everything I can to try to convince myself otherwise, right? Like, a lot of people, more people than Tenskwatawa after the earthquake I say this was going to happen, right? But not many people can predict it, 4 years out, Not many seismologists can have that level of prediction either.
How widely was that prophecy known among the Native Americans and among anybody else?
Yeah, so I have found evidence of it in a couple newspaper accounts, but they typically attribute it to Tecumseh. And I think that's the basis for a kind of mythology of Tecumseh that took off by the middle of the 19th century. That's quite related to the fact that William Tecumseh Sherman is named that, where there's a story that's told to this day that Tecumseh stomped his foot. And that was basically when Tecumseh visited Creeks to try to recruit them in this intertribal resistance movement. They rebuked him. He said, "I'm angry. When I get back home, I'm going to stomp my feet to show you how angry I am." And then the earthquakes occurred.
Did people immediately associate the earthquakes with prophecy?
So there are a couple people, like in missionary accounts and in a couple newspaper items, there are people who are saying, some people are saying the prophet said this. And given the way that the prophet's been written about before, people have argued that the prophet also foretold eclipses and other kinds of things, but typically, something would happen and then somebody says, "I told you that would happen," right? Not 4 years before the fact. But it's interesting kind of working through untangling the mythology associated with Tecumseh with the reality of Tenskwatawa's claim in 1807. That's been both a joy and a frustration for me. Yes?
Is it true that that earthquake changed the course of the Mississippi River?
Yeah, so contemporaneous accounts of boat pilots on the Mississippi said that they were basically brought upstream for like miles at times. And that was likely created by the fact that like water was disappearing into cracks. And so it was reversing the course of the Mississippi. If you compare, there were Mississippi pilot manuals that were written by a printer in Pittsburgh starting in the early 1800s. If you compare those manuals in the early 1800s to the 1820s and 30s, you can find all kinds of changes. So there were a lot of like islands either created or destroyed by the Mississippi River, or by the earthquakes in the Mississippi River. Reelfoot Lake in western Tennessee, which is apparently a great fishing spot because it's pretty shallow, was created by the earthquake. So there's all kinds of evidence of damage on the land that you can see to this day. And Dr. Valencius's book is also about kind of uncovering the fact that a lot of that damage has been kind of covered up by industrial agriculture.
For what it's worth, I think you're exactly right about the likelihood that the Quapaws had some knowledge of Tecumseh and his message. Because, as you know, the Indian networks were very efficient up and down the Mississippi River. And in particular, I know that the Quapaws in the 18th century were very, very much plugged into what Pontiac was doing, with a kind of a similar pan-Indian nativist resistance to white occupation. And in fact, they joined briefly in Pontiac's, what's usually called, though misleadingly, Pontiac's rebellion for a time before they decided that they would change their diplomatic course and become allies to the English. But yeah, these, as you know, these networks were very efficient. And the notion that somehow, even in the 18th century, we and the Quapaws were very isolated from the rest of the world, this won't hold up.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge amount of communication.
Yeah, the cosmopolitanism of Native America more broadly, I think, is something that really surprises people.
Yeah.
In terms of trade, in terms of information exchange. It's often thought that these kind of smaller societies exist as these closed societies, but that's certainly not the case. And Shawnees were really well positioned in the Ohio Valley to take advantage of that because they traveled widely across the continent.
And well, following up on that, as I was listening to your wonderful presentation, I was thinking about the pressures on the Native people in the Ohio Valley at the time of the New Madrid, or around the time of New Madrid. That was about the time of 1800 and froze to death in New England, which brought many, many Anglo people into the Ohio Valley. And it also brought disease into the Ohio Valley, not only with the New Englanders and the New Yorkers, but of course it went across the line. And it's also, as you were pointing out, when you begin to see disestablishment of religion in the Northeast, and you begin to see all of the ferment in religion among Christians. The Millerites and others who began to look for signs of all sorts in the world. And all of that's coming together from many, many directions.
Yeah, that's what's fascinating to me is the way that revivalism works across these cultures, right? So we talk about the Second Great Awakening. We might situate Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa within that very kind of frame in terms of thinking about revivalism, and the way that that revivalism threatens not only established religious orders in the United States, but it threatens established political and social orders within Indian country, right? So there's a reason why there's a sworn native enemy of the prophet who's talking about this prophecy to missionaries. Is a lot of native people are nervous about the consequences of this intertribal militancy against the U.S. Many people had tried that in generations prior, dating back to Pontiac, and they wanted to take a different tact. There's also all kinds of really interesting other sort of oddities in the weather at the time. So there was a comet in 1811, if anybody's ever read, I think, War and Peace. This is also the era of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. And I think a comet is central in like some of Tolstoy's writing, right? So people see this comet across the world in the fall of 1811, periods of flooding and disease at the same time, really cold weather in the summertime previously, right? So there's all kinds of sort of environmental oddities related to the weather and geology and going on. I also figured out, I should say, that people were much more apt to have evangelical conversion experiences when it was really humid. And they literally write about they write about atmospheric conditions. They talk about calm, lowering weather, like low pressure that accompanies like the earthquakes, and there's all kinds of things people look to the sky to interpret the earthquakes at the time.
I'd like to ask a question about the New Madrid Act. Did it only apply to people who lived in New Madrid County? What about the people who lived in Tennessee?
Yeah.
Where Real Foot was, and they were farmers. Did it not apply to them, or people in our territory?
So it did only apply to New Madrid County. I would say that like the area of Real Foot would have been more Chickasaw at the time. So there's really not as many U.S. settlers this far west. It's really after the War of 1812 that the floodgates of settlement really open up. It didn't apply beyond this small area, but it still had these broader impacts because people recognized that this is an opportunity for free land.
And a follow-up question. Say you own 50 acres. Did you get a certificate for 160 acres?
Well, that's the issue that these government officials had, is they didn't get any kind of direction from the national authority, right, from the Congress. Like, we don't even know who these people are, right? And one of their concerns was that people were trading, less land for more land. And this land was, there were US settlers in New Madrid at the time because the Spanish government invited them after the American Revolution. That's why it's called New Madrid. So all like the records were likely maybe even in Spanish, right? So it created this kind of bureaucratic mess. And in that bureaucratic mess, there was opportunity for fraud.
Quapaw line runs right through this building.
Oh, wow.
And it goes right to the River Market Tower, courtyard side, between Tough Nut, and straight down. From the bridge through here, and there's a marker on 3rd Street.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out which side we were on, but it makes me feel better that we're literally on top of it. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
It's right there.
Yeah, I know you're not a geologist, but
yeah,
I heard recently somebody, and I'm not sure how valid it was, mentioned that the Crowleys Ridge is a landform that was created by the New Madrid trembles. Is that?
I have not heard that, but I'm not certain of that.
I just wondered how valid that was.
Yeah, it could well be a kind of more ancient earthquake as well. Yeah.
So there are some geologists from the USGS looking into that, but from more ancient than 1811 and 12. They're using LiDAR data to look at landform changes. This Crowleys Ridge takes a little bit of a angle change down by Helena. So it is something being considered.
You can do, there's a driving tour guidebook that's been created in consultation with paleoseismologists to sort of look at aspects of the landscape that have been shaped not only by this earthquake, but by other earthquakes that have to do with this fault.
What tectonic plates meeting caused that earthquake?
So it's called the New Madrid Fault, which is a different kind of fault line than what you see in the Pacific, in California, where it's more seismologically active due to the fact that the fault lines are shaped differently, and I'm not actually certain, this is where I'm way over my skis. There's something about sort of how plates interact with one another that makes where we are different than California, and it also means that it doesn't happen as often, but when it does, it's kind of a big deal here. Although it's interesting to think about the fact that this region in particular has become more seismologically active due to hydraulic fracturing, particularly in Oklahoma.
Big one. Where are you? When do you think the book will come out?
That is a good question. It is in the hands of readers at University of North Carolina Press right now. So I leave it to their judgment, but I hope that it's 2021 is what I'm hoping for. So maybe not next year, but the year following.
Great. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Let's hope we don't have another earthquake before.
Yeah.
We don't want to claim.
These places on your map show where people felt the earthquake?
Yeah, these are just a couple spots that this is an image from the book, that are significant. So there's a plantation owner in Natchez who is incredibly nervous about the fact that this is happening. Tecumseh is where Tecumseh spoke to the Creeks, so where the alleged kind of foot stomping threat came from. Spring Place is a mission site among Cherokees where they recorded Cherokee prophecies. Philadelphia is kind of the largest U.S. city along the Atlantic coast that it was felt. That Oto town is the furthest west of an account that I found. So, yeah.
My earliest family reference to the New Madrid earthquake was from my mother's sister. She did some genealogy work for our family, And she came across an ancestor named Isaac Cates, who was an early settler of Hot Springs. And she found an account he wrote where he actually felt that in Hot Springs, or maybe Garland County, the effect of the New Madrid earthquake at the time. That's why I was wondering, how far away do you find references to feeling the earthquake?
Yeah, I found hundreds. And what's really interesting is that in family Bibles at the time, you often find references to them in particular. And also there were some oral history projects done. Late 19th century Americans were really interested in interviewing ancestors about kind of pioneer days. And a lot of people look back, just as the Quapaws did, on the earthquakes as being one of these kind of signal events in their lives, right? They thought of this as like, you know, the moon landing or September 11th or something like that, right? In terms of its significance in people's lifetimes.
Well, thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks.